Mhm. Well, let's get this started. So I'd like to say first off, welcome. Thank you everybody for coming and joining us on this glorious, finely dry, lovely evening. I just want to let you know that this conversation will be recorded. So if you have any issues with that, please let me know. We'll make adjustments or just leave. Anyway, so tonight we are joined by Tom Hughes, who's a senior strategist, Jordan Heiden, who's Keep Vermont Cool campaign manager, and Josh Ferguson is the organizing advocate for VPIRG. They're joining us to talk about their new Make Big Oil Pay campaign. I'm excited to hear about it, learn from it. I know I already have some questions. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. If you're new to our community conversation, we have about 15, 20 minutes of conversation, and then the remaining hour is open for questions. And so, yeah, the remaining 40 minutes or so are left for question and answer time. So please feel free to put them in the chat, or by the end, we can just call on people as they come up. So without anything else, go ahead. I should say, take it away, VPIRG.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having us this evening to talk about our new campaign to make big oil pay. I'm going to share my screen here and get us started. Well, thank you, everybody, for this opportunity. Tonight, we're hoping to have a conversation about what climate change is costing you. I am joined by two of my colleagues, Jordan Heiden, the Keep Vermont Cool campaign manager at VPIRG, and Josh Ferguson, our newest organizing advocate. And we're going to start this evening with a survey link that Josh is going to put into the chat. And we'd love to, if you're able to multitask, we'd love it if you could fill this survey out as we go along this evening. It's great information for us, and I think it'll help spark some of the conversation we're hoping to have a little bit later on. Our agenda this evening is pretty simple. Jordan is going to review some of the many ways that climate change is costing Vermonters, and then we'll have a conversation about how climate change is impacting your life, your community, and the state of Vermont. Then we'll transition to our proposal to make big oil pay for some of those costs. And we'll end with Josh talking about our upcoming community action tour. So with that, let me turn it over to Jordan to talk about what climate change is costing Vermonters.
Great. Thank you, Tom, and thank you everyone for having us here with you this evening. We're super excited to talk about a brand new campaign. But I guess let's start with a rather uncomfortable truth. So for more than 50 years, big oil has been lying to us. They've been covering up the fact that they have long known just how dangerous the fossil fuels they produce are for our planet. And this is the headline of a front page Wall Street Journal article earlier this month titled "Inside Exxon's Strategy to Downplay Climate Change." They knew that their products would cause incalculable harm, but they lied about it. And their cover-up wasted up the limited time that we had to avoid disasters like the ones Vermonters have experienced this year. Their products have given kids asthma, and in fact, there are 9,000 kids in Vermont with asthma as of 2019. Big oil has delayed and delayed while air pollution, primarily caused by fossil fuels, contributes to 1 in 5 deaths globally each year. Climate change also means that tick season in Vermont is now a year-round nuisance. While blue-green algae is polluting our lakes, and climate change is stretching local government budgets in all sorts of ways. In addition, it's the extreme weather that's hitting Vermont hard, but it's become so frequent that it feels like the new normal. So right now we're going to look at some of the extreme weather that we've had over the last year. So it was 61 degrees in Montpelier on New Year's Eve. But again, this is becoming the new normal. And these are the temperature records set in Montpelier since 2020. And the data goes all the way back 75 years since 1948. So every red square represents a new record high set in the last 3.5 years. And every blue square represents a new record low in that same 42-month period. So in the last 3.5 years, there have been 6 times as many record hot days as record cold days. And statistically speaking, for a 3.5-year period, we should see about 18 record highs and 18 record lows. But instead, we're seeing 42 record highs, more than twice what we would expect, and only 9 record lows, just half the number that we would expect. So it highlights something that you may have heard if you followed the Keep Vermont Cool campaign, and that is winters are getting warmer. And in fact, no city in the continental United States has experienced more winter warming than Burlington, Vermont. And it's now more than 7 degrees warmer on average in the winter than it was 50 years ago. That warm weather is wreaking havoc on our ski areas, and while it's definitely getting warmer, the cold weather is also reaching extremes. It was 108 below zero with the wind chill on top of Mount Washington at the beginning of February. That's the coldest wind chill ever reported. But again, overall, this was one of the warmest Vermont winters on record, and it led right into a very hot spring, juxtaposed with a very cold snap in May that caused millions of dollars in damages to Vermont crops. And at the beginning of the summer, much of Vermont was experiencing a drought. And then the state was blanketed in wildfire smoke blowing in from northern Ontario and western Canada. And then, of course, came the rain. Vermont received a month's worth of rain in just a few short hours, and that flooding was catastrophic. Major damage was recorded from south to north in places like Londonderry, Ludlow, Bridgewater, Barrie, Montpelier, Richmond, and Johnson, just to name a few. These floods walloped families and farmers across the state, and it's going to take years and hundreds of millions of dollars to recover. But again, this isn't a surprise. We worked with an organization based in New York City this last summer called Rebuild by Design, and in their Atlas of Disaster, which Josh will link in the chat right now, they found that Vermont has had the 7th highest number of federally declared disasters in the country over the last decade. And we've had the 5th highest per capita spending on climate disasters since 2011. So those costs are only going to go up. And UVM researchers have forecast that flooding alone will cost Vermonters $5.2 billion in the decades ahead. So let's pause right here. If you've had the chance to complete that survey already, thank you. And whether you've had the chance to fill it out yet or not, it would be a great time to share either in the chat below or raising your hand just some examples of how climate change is costing you, your community, or the state of Vermont. So again, I'll pause there and you can take some time to think about that and we can have a bit of conversation. Matthew, I see a hand up. We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, and I'm not going to take time about this. I know what it's costing me. Yes, everybody, my name is Matthew LaFleur. I live actually in Grand Isle County. I use he, him pronouns. What climate change is costing me? Let me see, my health, actually. I have asthma. Thank you for bringing that up, Jordan, because as an individual with disability with health-related issues, climate change is, costing me my health, basically. But also what I see in my town is, economic disparity. It's not just economic, but environmental too as well. Like I told FEMA in the previous time, it ain't just the environment that's, altered. It's the environment and the space around that building that's altered. So it's just the environment in itself is altered, which, that's what I see around, the state, but also within my community trying to basically, that's costing us basically money that we should never have to pay because, it should be the money should be there to prevent this from happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for sharing your story, your experience. I'm sorry that it's something you're going through, but of course, as we know, This is something that we're all facing in our own way. So again, appreciate you taking the time. I do also see a response in the chat. My super high Energy Star and well-drained basement flooded. Had no clue that that was possible. Oof, I am sorry to hear that, Suzanne. My 90-year-old father and 5-year-old daughter were both battling tick-borne diseases 2 years ago. Multiple trips to the doctors to clear those up. Oof, yeah. Ticks are everywhere now, which is terrifying. I am constantly worried about those. Okay, Isaac, I see another hand up. Go for it.
Thanks. Something that I have seen is just so many people losing their homes in Vermont from the flooding in particular. In addition to the health challenges, the economic challenges with the impact on the ski industry and on maple sugaring, it's just affecting the character of our state and things that are important and symbolic for our state. For example, I learned from a UVM report that in the next 20 years, 25 years, we can expect for the common loon to be gone from our state, and for the hermit thrush, which is our state bird, to be gone from our fields and forests. And that really hit me. I felt really sad when I learned that, because, well, don't spend a lot of time watching hermit thrushes flying around. Just the fact that this is our state bird, something symbolic of who we are, and that would be no longer able to survive in our state because of the climate crisis. That just made me sad.
Yeah, I had no idea that that was the case, and that makes me extremely sad too. I love the loons, and I can't really imagine not seeing them on our lakes. So thank you for sharing, and I guess bringing that to my attention. Would anybody else like to share? No pressure if not, and you can keep working on your survey, but just want to make sure we grab everybody before we move on. And I'll also just say that living in Berry City, it's definitely been scary watching how the floods have taken place, and all of our communities and businesses that are still down and still struggling to pick up the pieces. It's definitely difficult to watch. Rob, I see a hand up.
Yeah, I just want to add into, I live just a quarter mile from the Capitol in downtown Montpelier, and it is just shocking. Like I thrive on the vibrancy of this town. It's part of my fabric. Anybody who's ever walked through Montpelier during the middle of the day will know I like to work on the street. So to remove that as part of this community has just been a shock. It's made my life totally depressing, being here in this town that I love. But then it's been heartwarming seeing all the community spirit to come to rebuild. But there's also that thought, like, when's the next flood going to happen? And you know how much damage, and like this community's been so supportive of acting on climate. Mary Hooper was our longtime state rep, has been one of the best on climate issues, but here we are facing the impact, so we're not alone. And then also myself personally, I have a family relationship to Hawaii, so then to see the wildfires in Maui, it just totally destroys my thoughts and like my feeling of how much we're going to be able to conquer this. So
well, thank you, Rob, for sharing. I'm sorry to hear that. I can't imagine what it's like to be dealing with that here at home and dealing with family members in other parts of the country. It's a lot. It's too much for any one person to deal with. So my thoughts are definitely with you. Tom, I see your hand up.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm not sure if I'm on the video. I can't get my computer up and running, so I'm on my phone. But I work for a large nonprofit, humanitarian large nonprofit, and we were completely blindsided by this situation here in Vermont. Even after Hurricane Irene, it seemed like it. You heard the 1 in 100-year storm conversation, and now those 1 in 100-year storms are happening every decade. And it's spreading resources very thin. Of course, obviously the devastation and the folks that are, losing their home, their livelihood. Some Vermonters have been in their house has been in their family for generations. It's heartbreaking. And it's just, I guess I haven't necessarily experienced it personally, but secondhand, I would say I live in West Rutland. I'm a little higher up, so I was pretty fortunate. But driving through Center Rutland after the storm, I couldn't believe the damage that I saw, even in the Rutland area, which was nothing compared, of course, to Barry, Montpelier, Johnson, which I also unfortunately or fortunately got to see. So I think a lot of the things that we're trying to do now, I think it needs to happen a lot faster. I don't think we have the time that we think we do. I think these conversations have happened for too long with limited action, and I think that this is now this is the time for action, and I think it needs to be extreme action as well. I think it needs to happen like yesterday, kind of thing, in my perspective.
Yep, we could not agree with you more, Tom. And honestly, you've transitioned us beautifully into the next portion of the conversation. So we thank you for that, and of course for sharing your experience, your examples, and for all of you for doing that. So we will certainly be compiling those responses along with other responses from hundreds of more Vermonters this fall, and we will be sharing them with policymakers when they return to Montpelier in January. So again, thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. If there's anything else you would like to add to the conversation, feel free to pop it into the chat. But I think this is a really great place to sort of transition and move on to the next piece. So we will be making a proposal to save Vermonters money on future cleanup costs. And for that conversation, I'm going to pass things over to Tom.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Maybe you could advance to the next slide. So as we mentioned at the start, Big Oil knew that they knew for decades that their products would eventually cause the kind of damage, the kind of chaos that we are experiencing now. But they lied about it. And instead of acting responsibly, they instead funded a multi-million-dollar, decades-long disinformation campaign designed to confuse the press, the public, and policymakers about the dangers of fossil fuels. All the while, we've been paying this enormous cost for all of this cleanup activity, while Big Oil, next slide there, has been paying nothing in terms of cleanup costs. So not only have they not been paying, they have been getting filthy rich. Last year, the major fossil fuel companies made over $200 billion in profits. And next slide there, Jordan. While Vermonters have been left with the bill to clean up the mess. But there is hope. Let's go to that next slide. Next slide. We see it in our own polling. We've been working with the folks at the Yale Climate Communications Program, and earlier this year we did a poll with Data for Progress that found that Vermonters are way more concerned about climate change and are taking a lot more action on climate change than Americans as a whole. We see, next slide, we see climate change showing up in our popular culture in all sorts of ways. If you had the good fortune to make it to a Vermont Green FC game in the last couple of years, add your experience there in the chat, but they've been doing a great job of highlighting the importance of climate change. And there are, next slide, there's more climate champions in the legislature this session than there have ever been in the past. We're also already, next slide, taking the big oil companies to court. When TJ Donovan was Attorney General 2 years ago, he sued 4 of the major oil companies under Vermont's consumer protection laws. We think there's an opportunity to do even more. Next slide. 2 years ago, at the federal level, Democrats proposed a $500 billion Climate Superfund modeled off of the EPA Superfund, but this time use it for climate pollution rather than just toxic pollution. Next slide. Bernie Sanders was one of the lead proponents of this proposal on the Senate side. Next slide. Over on the House side, Peter Welch was a supporter as well. And next slide. We've taken this concept, which unfortunately didn't make it into federal law, and we spent the last 4 months knocking on people's doors across the state, talking about this idea of making big oil pay for the mess that they have made. It's based on the fundamental basic principle that most of us learned in kindergarten, that is, that if you make a mess, you should help clean it up. Greedy big oil, as we noted, isn't paying their fair share at the moment. Why do we think this, next slide, why do we think state level legislation is a viable path? Unfortunately, federal action, either litigation or legislation, seems to be blocked by either the Supreme Court or the U.S. House of Representatives. And then at the state level, there are several climate cases moving through the courts. Earlier this week, California announced that it's suing 5 of the big oil companies. And hopefully one of these cases breaks through. But it has been years that these cases have been in court, and the fossil fuel industry has been successful so far in delaying judgment on their on any of those cases. Maryland, Massachusetts, and New York, however, have taken this idea of a climate superfund and are pursuing it at the state level. We at VPIRG and with this Make Big Oil Pay campaign are pushing Vermont legislators to join their neighbors in Massachusetts, Maryland, and New York and pursue accountability through legislation. Next slide. Over in New York, the bill has progressed the farthest of the 3 states that have already started this process. In New York, Senator Liz Krueger, who is the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, is the lead sponsor of the legislation. It passed their state Senate earlier this summer. Next slide. And their bill identifies 2 primary definitions for who would be responsible for paying into a climate superfund. The first is it's companies that have emitted over 1 billion tons of covered greenhouse gas emissions. These are the very largest oil companies in the world: ExxonMobil, Chevron, Shell, Saudi Aramco, BP, and those states that have a nexus or have a legal footprint within the state of New York. The New York legislation will serve as the likely basis for Vermont legislation. And next slide. Using those 2 definitions, there's really just 9 companies that would be potential responsible parties here in Vermont. It will be up to the legislature to set the ultimate parameters, but we're really thinking about ExxonMobil, Citgo, Shell, Chevron, Saudi Aramco, et cetera, as being the companies that would be responsible parties. We are not going after the mom and pop fuel dealer here in Vermont. Next slide. If our proposal is sort of modeled off of the New York proposal, we would be seeking $100 million a year for 25 years, a total of $2.5 billion. And the amounts would be roughly what you see there on the slide, each company being charged a little bit different based on their historic emissions. Next slide. Getting the money is one part of the equation. The next is putting that money to use. In New York, they've proposed, of course, infrastructure, repairs, disaster relief, preventative health care, weatherization and air conditioning for public buildings, and water cleanup as appropriations, and that 40% of all proceeds would go to, of all expenditures would go to support adaptive infrastructure that benefits disadvantaged communities. Let's go to this next slide, and let's pause here and have a little conversation about if there was $100 million a year or 2.5 billion over the next 25 years, how do you think that Vermont should put that money to use? And again, you could share those in the chat. You could raise your hand. Matthew.
If I had a wish, a magic, wand, all I like to see it used on is, making sure that Vermont has a resilient, climate plan, but also how to fund that plan too as well. Most plans don't happen if we don't have a plan in place, and plus also it's just, not just making a plan, but how to distribute that money equitably, because most, usually it goes down to the downtowns first, before any rural area gets their hands on it. That's how it usually is, climate funded that way. But how can we make that more, transitional in a way where it's most efficient? I'm also thinking about where that money most efficiently will help, not just efficiently, but how much we can save per, material when we do have those climate disasters that, that affect us all. How can we actually make sure the dollars that are not going over a certain budget? So we can look good and not looking at paper. The profile will look good, and the state won't have a problem with us if we keep it, like have an audit, why we're doing it. To say that it's going to go for one specific area. We're not going to use money that are specifically meant for that area, like the state has been doing. We had to shift money from other areas of Vermont just to cover our, expenses, which states are legally obligated to fill in those budgets, but also those states have to pay a certain tax. So but we're being using our climate funds to basically fund our general funds, which you should not be doing that. It should be set separately, and that's how Vermont's been doing to cover its bills, pretty much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew. And I see some great suggestions in the chat as well. In the beginning, focus on education and awareness, spending some of these dollars on affordable housing, on non-floodplain sites, obviously very important that we get Vermonters out of the floodplain. And as we know, learned this summer, the floodplain maps aren't up to date, and they don't recognize all the dangers. And then expanding the rapid and rural transit is another suggestion I saw there. Anybody else want to raise their hand and share a suggestion on how a Climate Superfund could be put to use here in Vermont? Well, again, this is a question within the survey itself. If you haven't had a chance to get to that, it would be great if you could fill that out. Again, we will share the information here collected with legislators as we head into the 2024 legislative session. But we're also about to, this is one of our first opportunities to talk about the Big Oil Pay campaign in groups across the state. We're really excited to be here. We do have a rough cut of a television ad, which is going to start airing in a couple of weeks. And maybe I can turn it over to Jordan to show us that, and then hand it over to Josh, who can finish out the presentation part of tonight's conversation.
Climate change is hitting Vermont hard. People are hurting, businesses are closing, and towns don't have the money to keep up. But while we pay, some are getting rich.
U.S. oil companies announced record profits Friday.
Big Oil knew this would happen decades ago.
In the 1980s, Exxon had top scientists studying the possible effects of climate change.
Now, we're the ones stuck with the bill. It's time to make Big Oil pay.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Jordan, for really sort of putting that plainly and airing it all. And I'm sure, as I've heard from Tom, that action needed to start yesterday. And I'm sure after watching that video and hearing everyone's stories, you're wondering yourself, what can I do? And right here tonight, I have 2 solutions to things that will not take you longer than 5 minutes to complete. The first thing that you can do is contact your local representative and tell them that you support holding Big Oil responsible for the climate disaster we find ourselves facing right now. And that you also support creating a Climate Superfund to help protect Vermont. That would really help raise awareness, and I'm dropping a link to that where you can find your legislators' contact information in the chat right now. And the second thing that you can do tonight is contact our state treasurer, who is currently asking for public ideas on climate infrastructure financing. He is tasked with recommending to the state this winter and spring, how to best sort of use our finances, our tax dollars, to prevent a climate disaster like the summer from happening again. And he's currently seeking public advice on that. And so I'm going to drop another link, or you can take the blue link at the very bottom of the PowerPoint slide and directly email him from there. But if you'd like to sort of see his public message, here is a link to his website. And that is a very direct line of communication with your state representatives. If we can move to the next slide, please. All right, and so what are the next steps? For us over here at Make Big Oil Pay and VPIRG, our next steps is our community action tour. That's starting off on October 2nd in Middlebury, and we are going to be visiting every county in the state over the course of 6 or 7 weeks. You may find a local town that you might be interested in dropping by down in the lineup, or you can visit makebigoilpay.org/tour to really sort of get the full picture of how we're going to be interacting with our communities. We're going to showcase a couple of legislators who are going to speak on this matter, who are really supportive of this campaign. And we're really looking forward to sort of carrying the momentum we built this summer in our summer canvas into the state legislative session this winter. Yeah, so if we're ready to move on to the next slide. This is Jordan, Tom, and I's contact information, along with the link to our campaign website. And this will give you all of the info you want about what does Make Big Oil pay, where can you meet us in person? We're going to be out and about over the next few months, and we'd really like your all's participation and feedback so that we can take what we hear back from you all straight to our state representatives and make sure that they understand that, you know, the citizens of Vermont really care about passing climate legislation now. And I can't wait to communicate with you guys a little bit more over the next 20 minutes or so. Thank you so much for participating.
Well, thank you so much for that very informative and entertaining presentation. It was great. I loved the intermixing of the feedback and the questions and everything. Does anybody have any questions? Feel free to raise your hand or just go right ahead and speak up.
Matthew.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for bringing that tour, to like how can we make that a hybrid? Because I'm talking about accessibility, and I've been preaching to committees and subcommittees across the state, because not everybody can get to these tours. Is there a day and time, or is there a way we can make it hybrid, or better yet, make it interactive so it's a better, pleasant experience for everybody? Because to me, it's like you want that first impression, and that first impression will set a tone for the state. And I see that as going forward, you want to make that first impression. Thank you.
Jordan, as the campaign, the tour manager here, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Matthew, you raised some really important questions and considerations, and I would just say that accessibility is something that is always important to us when we're putting on an event or a tour or anything of that nature. And I was personally calling all of these venues, making sure that ADA accessibility was something that was possible, that everything is going to be completely usable for anybody who wants to come out. All of these events are free, they're open to the public, and again, ADA accessible. So in some of these cases, I think it's possible that hybrid might be something to consider, though that's not something that we've discussed yet as a team. So I think that's a little bit TBD. But I will say that for folks who are unable to go to in-person events, we will also be hosting a webinar at the end of this series, so that anybody who wasn't able to make it out, whether it's because they couldn't make that particular date or it was a little too far away, there will be an online component where it's basically the same exact thing, just through Zoom instead. And just to touch quickly on your consideration about interactivity, we will be making this as interactive as possible. So there will be breakout groups, there will be lots of activities that you can do in person, and it's sort of like an option for folks to pick whatever they feel most comfortable with, whether that is writing an op-ed, sharing a post on social media, sharing a climate story, or just kind of sharing resources and going back and forth with folks at your table. There's going to be a lot of different ways that you can get involved, and ways that you can sort of pick and choose what works best for you. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you. It's just those questions that, when people put on events, they see only one side of things. And, with Vermont, with the people that we have interactive in Vermont, we got an aging demographic that we got to really, basically be true to ourselves and true to the word that we're doing right here, because they're the ones that are going to feel the brunt effect of this negativity of climate change. And just something that I had to bring up because it's Vermont. Thank you.
We hope we'll see you in South Hero in a week or two.
Okay, this is Rob with the Vermont Sierra Club. We've went past our allotment of time. So Tom, do you have any final thoughts, or Jordan or Josh, just before we conclude this? And because I just have one more thing to say to answer that last point.
Just our request to you is please get involved in this Make Big Oil Pay campaign. We'd love to see you at one of the events, either in person or at the online event that we'll have in November. And the absolute best thing that you can do beyond showing up to one of those events is contacting your elected representatives and encouraging them to hold Big Oil accountable. And thank you so much for having us.
Good. Thank you, Jordan, Joshua, and Tom, of course. And thank you from behalf of the Sierra Club. For those who didn't know it, the Sierra Club voted to endorse this particular campaign. That doesn't mean we're going to be actively working on this, but when the critical time comes, we will alert our members to say that there's a need to act on this. But follow that campaign, because the VPIRG team is doing a great job getting around the state talking about this. Is very important. Obviously, we know climate has impacted all of our communities, but just from the Sierra Club angle, I just want to notify you all of a couple quick events that we're doing. This Saturday, in partnership with Burlington Electric Department's Net Zero Energy Festival, we're hosting a National Drive Electric Week event between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. That's at their Pine Street office, and they have a whole festival there. But we're going to be doing in the back a ride and drive event with EVs. Then on October 7th, we're doing a hike up Mount Philo and a conservation discussion with Third Act and the Green Mountain Club. And that one is ADA compliant because you could drive to the top, even though we don't normally encourage people to drive to the top of a mountain. You could drive to the top and walk the ADA trail, or if you have a accessible wheelchair to the lodge where we'll have our conversation. But you can just go to the Sierra Club Vermont website to do that. But anyway, stay in touch with the VPIRG team on this campaign. It's critical. It's critical to make the change on this, and we appreciate everybody for joining us, and have you all a good night. And thank you, Suzanne, for leading this off for us, who had to walk away for a moment. Thank you all.